3 black newborn triplets were abandoned at the hospital entrance. When the elderly volunteer saw them, he remembered the daughter he lost years ago. But what he did next left the entire hospital board speechless. Thunder cracked outside DVAL Hospital as Robert Hayes made his final rounds. His worn shoes squeaked against the freshly mopped floor of the pediatric wing. At 68, every step reminded him of his age, but he kept walking. He had to finish his volunteer shift. Going home soon, Mr. Hayes. Nancy, the night nurse, called from behind her desk. Just one more round, Robert said, adjusting his volunteer badge. Something doesn't feel right tonight. Lightning illuminated the hospital corridors through large windows. Rain pounded against the glass. Robert's joints ached with the weather, but 20 years of volunteering had taught him to ignore the pain. The emergency room entrance bell rang. Robert's head snapped up. He knew that sound. 3 rings meant urgent assistance needed. Mr. Hayes, don't, Nancy started, but Robert was already moving. He pushed through the double doors, the cool night air hitting his face. Rain soaked through his light blue volunteer shirt within seconds. There, under the entrance light, sat a cardboard box. "Dear God," Robert whispered, his heart pounding as he heard the cries. 3 tiny faces, dark skin wet with rain, looked up at him. Newborns, still covered in hospital bracelets. Robert's hands shook as he lifted the box. A folded paper fluttered to the ground. He grabbed it, tucking it into his pocket. The baby's cries grew louder. "Nancy," he shouted, carrying the box inside. "Call Dr. Matthews. Now!" The emergency room erupted into action. Nurses rushed forward, lifting the infants onto warming beds. Robert stood back, water dripping onto the floor, watching as they worked. "Triplets," Dr. Matthews announced, checking their vital signs. "Girls. They can't be more than a few days old." Robert pulled out the wet note, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. "Asterisk, please take care of them. I can't. Asterisk." The words hit him like a physical blow. 20 years ago, he had stood in this same emergency room, holding his daughter Sarah's hand as she fought for breath. He couldn't save her then. "Mr. Hayes." Dr. Matthews touched his arm. "You should go home, get dry." Robert shook his head. "I'll stay. Just let me stay with them." Hours passed. Social services arrived. A tired woman named Linda with a laptop and stack of forms. Robert sat outside the nursery, watching through the window as nurses fed and changed the babies. "It's complicated with triplets," Linda said, typing into her laptop. "We'll have to separate them. Different foster homes have different capacities." "Separate them?" Robert's voice cracked. "They are sisters. It's the system, Mr. Hayes. Finding a home for 3 infants at once, it's nearly impossible." Robert pressed his hand against the glass. The middle triplet turned her head, dark eyes finding his. Her tiny fingers curled into a fist. "Asterisk, just like Sarah's did." Asterisk when? He asked, not looking away from the babies. "We'll start processing tomorrow. Maybe by the end of the week." "No." Robert turned to face her. "You can't separate them." "I won't let you." Linda sighed, closing her laptop. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, you're a volunteer. This isn't your decision." "Then whose decision is it?" Robert's voice rose. Several nurses looked up. "Who decides to tear apart 3 sisters before they even have a chance?" The system is wrong." Robert straightened his back, ignoring the ache. "I want to speak to the hospital board. Now." "It's midnight, Mr. Hayes." "Then wake them up." The smallest triplet started crying, setting off her sisters. Robert watched as nurses rushed to comfort them. His chest tightened with a familiar pain, the same pain he'd felt watching Sarah slip away. "I'll make some calls," Linda finally said, reaching for her phone. "But Mr. Hayes, what exactly are you planning to do?" Robert thought of his empty house, of Sarah's room untouched for 20 years, of his wife's garden now overgrown. He thought of 20 years walking these halls, trying to fill a void that nothing could fill. "Whatever I have to," he said. The storm raged on outside, but inside the nursery, 3 little girls slept peacefully, unaware of the battle about to begin for their future. Robert pulled up a chair, his wet clothes now merely damp, and settled in for a long night. Nancy brought him coffee around 2 a.m. "The board's coming in early." 7 a.m. "Thank you." Robert took the cup with shaking hands. "You know what they'll say, don't you?" Nancy sat beside him. "About your age, about being single, about everything, Robert finished. I know. They sat in silence, watching the triplets sleep. Finally, Nancy spoke again, her voice soft. This isn't like Sarah, Robert. You can't fix the past. I'm not trying to. Robert stood, his joints protesting. But I can change their future. As dawn approached, Robert Hayes made a decision that would change multiple lives. His own, and 3 tiny ones who had been left in the rain. The morning would bring questions, doubts, and opposition. But for now, he simply watched over 3 sleeping babies, remembering another night long ago when he had promised his daughter he would never stop helping others. The smallest triplet stirred, her face scrunching up. Robert reached through the nursery window, gently touching her hand. She grabbed his finger, holding on tight, and Robert Hayes, for the first time in 20 years, felt something break and heal inside him at the same moment. I'm here, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Robert's back ached from the plastic chair as sunlight crept into the hospital corridor. He hadn't moved from his spot outside the nursery for 5 hours. The triplets slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Mr. Hayes. Dr. Matthews approached, holding a fresh coffee. The board is gathering in conference room A. Robert stood slowly, his joints cracking. How are they? Stable. But the smallest one. Dr. Matthews hesitated. She's showing signs of respiratory distress. Nothing serious yet. But we're monitoring her. The words hit Robert's stomach like a punch. He'd heard similar words 20 years ago about Sarah. I need to speak to them before they go in, Robert said, straightening his rumpled volunteer shirt. Robert! Dr. Matthews grabbed his arm. They're not going to listen. You're just a volunteer. Then I'll make them listen. The conference room door loomed ahead. Through the glass, Robert saw them, 5 board members in press suits, Linda from social services, and the hospital's legal counsel. They looked fresh, alert, ready for battle. Robert pushed open the door. The conversation stopped. Mr. Hayes, Board Chairman Wilson said, please wait outside. We'll call you when. My daughter died in this hospital. Robert cut in. The room fell silent. 20 years ago. Rare genetic disorder. Nothing anyone could do. He stepped forward, hand steady despite his exhaustion. I watched her die. Held her hand. Promised her I'd help other children. That's why I've been here every day for 20 years. Mr. Hayes, we understand your dedication. But, no, you don't. Robert's voice hardened. You don't understand what it's like to lose a child. To watch 3 babies being torn apart because it's convenient for the system. Linda shifted uncomfortably. The foster care system has protocols. To hell with your protocols. Robert slammed his hand on the table. Coffee cups rattled. Those girls need each other. They need stability. They need you. Chairman Wilson raised an eyebrow. A 68-year-old widower with a history of depression. The word stung, but Robert stood his ground. Yes, Mr. Hayes. The legal counsel spoke softly. Your wife's death, followed by your daughter's, the hospital records show you were treated for severe depression for 2 years. And I survived it. Robert looked each board member in the eye. I came back. I helped others. Ask any patient in this hospital about me. A knock interrupted them. Nancy poked her head in. Sorry, but Mr. Hayes, the smallest triplet. Her breathing. Robert was moving before she finished speaking. He rushed down the corridor, his heart pounding. Inside the nursery, nurses huddled around the incubator. Oxygen saturation dropping, one called out. Start supplemental oxygen, 2 liters. Dr. Matthews ordered, pushing past Robert. Robert watched, helpless, as they worked. The baby's tiny chest heaved with each breath. Her sisters, sensing something wrong, began to cry. Sarah, he whispered. Not again. Please. Hours blurred together. Robert stayed, watching the monitors, counting each breath. The board meeting continued without him. He didn't care. Around noon, Dr. Matthews emerged from the nursery. She's stable, he said, but she'll need constant monitoring. Special care. Robert nodded, not trusting his voice. The boards made their decision, Dr. Matthews continued. They're processing the separation papers now. Each girl will go to a different foster home by the end of the week. No. Robert's voice was barely audible. What? I said no. He straightened up. Get me the adoption forms. Dr. Matthews stared at him. Robert, Be reasonable. Your age, your history, the responsibility of 3 infants. Sarah died because we couldn't fight her disease, Robert said. But I can fight this. I can fight for them. The board will never approve it. Then I'll go over their heads. I'll hire lawyers. I'll sell my house. Whatever it takes. A commotion at the end of the hallway drew their attention. Linda from social services was arguing with Nancy. The paperwork is filed, Linda was saying. We have foster homes ready in 3 different counties. 3 counties. Robert's voice cracked. You're not just separating them. You're making sure they never find each other again. Linda wouldn't meet his eyes. It's the best we could do on short notice. Robert walked back to the nursery window. The smallest triplet was sleeping, oxygen tube under her tiny nose. Her sisters reached toward her through their incubator walls. They know, he said. They can feel when one of them is hurting. Nancy touched his shoulder. Robert, go home. Rest. You've been here for 24 hours. I can't. His voice broke. Sarah, when she was sick, I left to rest. When I came back, the memory hit him full force. The flatline alarm. The doctors rushing in. Sarah's hand, still warm, slipping from his grasp. Mr. Hayes. Linda approached cautiously. The first transport arrives tomorrow morning at 8. Tomorrow. 8 a.m. Just like Sarah's last morning. Robert turned to Dr. Matthews. The small one. What are her chances if she's moved now? The doctor hesitated. In her condition, any stress could. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Robert walked to the nursery door, pushed it open. The nurses stepped aside as he approached the incubators. 3 pairs of dark eyes tracked his movement. Hey there, he whispered. Remember me? The smallest one turned toward his voice. Her oxygen stats rose slightly. She responds to you, a nurse said quietly. Robert placed his hand on the incubator. I couldn't save my daughter, but I'm not losing you 3. Not like this. He turned to Linda. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow to start the separation process. Yes, then I have until 8 a.m. to stop you. Robert pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. He scrolled through his contacts, found the number he needed. 20 years ago, he'd been powerless. But not this time. Not with these 3 lives hanging in the balance. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. James? It's Robert Hayes. Remember that favor you owe me? I need a lawyer. A good one. Now. 7 hours until the separation. Robert sat in the hospital cafeteria, the harsh fluorescent lights making his tired eyes burn. Across from him, James Chen spread out papers across the table, his suit jacket draped over a chair. Let me be straight with you, Robert, James said, tapping a document. The odds aren't good. Single man, your age, 3 infants. Courts don't like unusual situations. Robert rubbed his face. They're going to separate them tomorrow. I know. James leaned forward. But rushing into a custody battle isn't the answer. You need time. Preparation. They don't have time. Robert's voice cracked. The smallest one is sick. If they move her, Mr. Hayes. Robert turned. Nancy stood there, still in her scrubs. She's asking for you. Babies don't ask for people, James said. These ones do, Nancy replied. Her oxygen levels drop every time he's gone too long. Robert stood, his chair scraping against the floor. We'll finish this later. Robert, James called after him. Think about what you're doing. Really think. The elevator ride to the pediatric floor felt endless. Robert's reflection in the metal doors showed every one of his 68 years. Dark circles under his eyes. Deep lines around his mouth. Gray hair uncombed. The smallest triplet's monitors beeped steadily as he entered the nursery. Her oxygen levels rose 2 points. See? Nancy said softly. She knows. Robert placed his hand on the incubator. Hey there, little fighter. They need names, a young nurse said, changing the middle triplet's diaper. We can't keep calling them baby A, B, and C. Names. Robert hadn't let himself think that far ahead. Names meant attachment. Attachment meant the pain would be worse when they took them away. Sarah, he whispered. My daughter, she always wanted sisters. The smallest triplet grabbed his finger through the incubator port. A commotion outside drew their attention. Linda from social services argued with someone in the hallway. The foster homes are confirmed, she said. We can't change the arrangements now. They're making her sicker. The voice belonged to Dr. Matthews. The stress of separation could. That's not my concern. The system. To hell with your system. Dr. Matthews' voice rose. I won't clear her for transport. Not in her condition. Robert's heart pounded. He looked at the monitors, at the tiny girl fighting for every breath, at her sisters, reaching for each other through plastic walls. The nursery door opened. Chairman Wilson walked in, followed by Linda and Dr. Matthews. Mr. Hayes, Wilson said. A word. Robert didn't move. Say it here. Wilson sighed. Your lawyer contacted the board. Made some implications about negligence if we separate the infants against medical advice. Smart man, Robert said. It's not that simple. Wilson stepped closer. Your history, Mr. Hayes. The depression after your wife and daughter. Ancient history. Is it? Wilson's voice softened. 3 babies is a huge responsibility. The sleepless nights. The constant care. Alone. Robert watched the triplets. The smallest one's oxygen levels were dropping again. He reached in, touched her hand. The numbers stabilized. I'm already responsible, he said quietly. The moment I found them, I became responsible. The board's concern. Linda started. I don't care about the board's concern. Robert turned to face them. 20 years ago, I couldn't save my daughter. I watched her die in this hospital, in this ward, because there was nothing anyone could do. But this. He gestured to the triplets. This we can fix. This we can change. Dr. Matthews stepped forward. The smallest one needs specialized care. Constant monitoring. I'll learn, Robert said. I'll take classes. Whatever it takes. Mr. Hayes, Linda tried again. The foster homes are waiting. They're good homes, with experienced parents, separate homes. Robert's voice hardened. Miles apart. Different counties. These girls will grow up never knowing they had sisters. Never understanding why they feel like something's missing. The smallest triplet's monitor beeped. Her oxygen dipped dangerously low. Out, Dr. Matthews ordered. Everyone out except Mr. Hayes. They watched through the window as Robert spoke softly to the baby, her stats slowly climbing back to normal. 6 hours, Linda said. The transport arrives in 6 hours. Robert didn't look up from the incubator. Then you have 6 hours to decide. Let me fight for custody of all 3, or I'll take this to every news station in the state. Let them see how your system tears apart sick babies. You wouldn't, Linda gasped. Try me. James appeared in the hallway, more papers in hand. Robert? We need to talk strategy. No. Robert straightened up. No more talk. Either they let me apply for emergency custody of all 3, or this goes public tonight. Wilson and Linda exchanged looks. The press would have a field day, James added helpfully. Elderly volunteer fights to save triplets from separation. Sick baby at risk. Human interest gold. Wilson rubbed his temples. You're blackmailing us. I'm fighting for them. Robert's voice broke. Just like I should have fought harder for Sarah. The smallest triplet's monitor beeped again. Without looking, Robert reached into the incubator. Her tiny hand found his finger. The beeping stabilized. Dr. Matthews checked the monitors. Her stats are best when he's here. That's documented fact now. 5 hours, Linda said quietly. Robert watched the sun beginning to rise through the hospital windows. In 5 hours, they would try to tear these sisters apart. In 5 hours, they would repeat a system that broke families, that scattered siblings to the winds. Unless he stopped it. I'm 68 years old, he said to the room. I lost my wife to cancer. My daughter to a genetic disorder. I've spent 20 years walking these halls, trying to help other people's children because I couldn't save my own. He turned to face them. I have a 3-bedroom house, a good pension, savings I've never touched, and more love left to give than I thought possible. The middle triplet started to fuss. Then the largest. Within seconds, all 3 were crying. Together, Robert said over their cries. They stay together. Even if I have to go to court, sell my house, fight the whole damn system. They stay together. Wilson looked at Linda. Linda looked at Dr. Matthews. Dr. Matthews looked at the monitors. 4 hours and 50 minutes, Linda finally said. That's how long you have to file emergency custody paperwork before the transport arrives. James stepped forward. The papers are ready. Have been since midnight. Robert felt tears burning his eyes. You knew I'd fight. For 20 years, James said. You fought for every child in this hospital. Did you think we wouldn't fight for you? The sun rose over DVAL Hospital as Robert Hayes signed his name on dozens of documents. With each signature, he made a promise. To 3 baby girls who needed him. To a daughter he couldn't save. To himself. The transport vehicles arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. They left empty. The family court waiting room smelled of old coffee and anxiety. Robert straightened his tie for the 10th time, the new suit stiff against his skin. 2 weeks had passed since he'd signed the emergency custody papers. 2 weeks of sleeping in a hospital chair, learning to change diapers, and fighting the system. Stop fidgeting, James whispered beside him. You'll wrinkle the suit. It's already wrinkled. Robert looked down at his lap. Just like me. The door opened. A stern-faced clerk appeared. The court will hear Hayes versus Department of Social Services now. Robert stood, his knees cracking. The smallest triplet, now named Faith, had been cleared for transport yesterday. Her sisters, Hope and Grace, were already at his house with a court-appointed nurse. The names had come to him during one of his late-night vigils, what they needed most in this fight. The courtroom felt colder than the hospital. Judge Martinez sat high on her bench, reading through papers as they entered. Linda from Social Services sat at the opposite table, flanked by 2 government attorneys. Your Honor, James began. We're here seeking permanent custody. I've read the briefs. Judge Martinez cut in. She looked directly at Robert. Mr. Hayes, approached the bench. Robert walked forward, his dress shoes squeaking on the polished floor. You're 68 years old, the judge said. Yes, Your Honor. Widowed. History of clinical depression. Living alone. Yes. And you want to adopt 3 newborn triplets. Robert met her gaze. I don't want to, Your Honor. I need to. Explain. Robert took a deep breath. 20 years ago, I lost my daughter in that hospital. I couldn't save her. But I can save these girls. Keep them together. Give them a home. Mr. Hayes, Linda stood up. While your intentions are admirable, the reality is, Robert interrupted, is that Faith's oxygen levels drop every time someone mentions separation. The reality is that Hope won't eat unless she can see her sisters. The reality is that Grace cries until someone puts them all together. Your Honor, one of the government attorneys stepped forward. Mr. Hayes has no experience with infants. No support system. No. I have 20 years of volunteer experience. Robert's voice rose. I have a house that's paid for. I have savings. And I have more love to give than any 3 separate homes could provide. Judge Martinez held up a hand. Mr. Hayes, love isn't enough. These children need. I know what they need. Robert's hands gripped the podium. They need someone who'll wake up for every feeding. Who'll learn every cry. Who'll fight every battle. They need someone who sees them as people, not case numbers to be distributed. The courtroom fell silent. Your Honor, James said quietly. In the 2 weeks since Mr. Hayes filed for emergency custody, he has completed 3 parenting classes. He's hired a part-time nurse. He's converted his home office into a nursery. And most importantly, the smallest triplet's health has stabilized under his care. Linda shuffled her papers. The system has protocols. The system is wrong. Robert turned to face her. You are going to separate them. Send them to different counties. Make sure they never found each other. How is that better than one home? One family? Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez leaned forward. What happens when you get older? When the girls are teenagers. When I die. Robert finished. The room tensed. Then they'll have each other. Sisters. Family. Not scattered strangers who never knew they were part of something bigger. The judge studied him for a long moment. Dr. Matthews from DVAL Hospital submitted a brief. He says the smallest triplet's health is directly linked to your presence. Faith, Robert corrected. Her name is Faith. And yes, her oxygen levels stabilize when I'm there. Why those names? The judge asked suddenly. Faith, Hope, and Grace. Robert's throat tightened. Because that's what they gave me. What they need. What I need to give them. Your Honor, Linda tried again. The statistical likelihood of a single man his age successfully raising. Statistics. Robert's laugh was harsh. What are the statistics on triplets being abandoned in a storm? On a grieving father finding new purpose? On love beating a broken system? Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting your emotional attachment overrules established protocols? I'm suggesting that sometimes the right thing doesn't fit in a protocol. Robert's voice softened. These girls deserve to grow up together, to know each other, to have a family, and you think you can provide that? I know I can. The judge shuffled papers. I have reports here from the hospital board. They initially opposed your custody request. They did. What changed? Robert thought of the nights in the nursery, the way the girls reached for each other, the way Faith's monitors steadied when he spoke. They saw what I saw, he said simply. 3 sisters who need each other, and someone who needs them just as much. Your history of depression made me stronger. Robert straightened his shoulders. I survived losing my wife and daughter. I came back, helped others. These girls, they're not a replacement. They're a chance to do what I couldn't do before. Save someone. Keep a family together. The judge looked at her watch. This hearing was scheduled for 2 hours. We've barely started, and I have dozens of questions about practical arrangements, financial plans. A commotion at the back of the courtroom interrupted her. Dr. Matthews burst in, still in his hospital scrubs. Your Honor, I apologize, but... He caught his breath. Face oxygen levels have been dropping since Mr. Hayes left. The other girls are inconsolable at his house. The nurse just called. Robert's heart clenched. I need to go, Judge Martinez said suddenly. Everyone stared at her. Mr. Hayes, go. Now. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Robert was moving before she finished speaking. At the door, he turned back. Your Honor, they're not just case files. They're not just statistics. They're 3 little girls who need each other. Who need me. And I need them. The judge nodded once. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late. Robert ran through the courthouse, James following with their papers. Outside, Dr. Matthews' car waited. Faith first, Robert said, jumping in, then home to the others. As they sped toward the hospital, Robert loosened his tie. The new suit didn't matter. The wrinkles didn't matter. All that mattered was getting back to his girls. His girls. When had that happened? When had they become his? Maybe in that first storm. Maybe in the long nights watching monitors. Maybe in the moment he named them, giving voice to everything they meant. Faith, fighting for every breath. Hope, reaching for her sisters. Grace, binding them all together. The hospital came into view. Robert was out of the car before it fully stopped, running through familiar halls to the nursery where it all began. Faith's monitors stabilized the moment he touched her hand. I'm here, he whispered. Daddy's here. And for the first time, saying those words felt completely right. Robert sat in his living room at 3 a.m., Faith cradled against his chest while her sisters slept in their cribs. The house hadn't been this alive in 20 years. Baby bottles lined the kitchen counter. Diapers filled the shopping bags. 3 bassinets crowded his once-empty living room. The court-appointed nurse, Maria, walked in quietly. Mr. Hayes, I can take her. You need sleep. She just got her breathing stable, Robert whispered. A few more minutes. Maria checked Faith's oxygen monitor. Numbers are good. Better than the hospital. A thick manila envelope sat unopened on the coffee table. James had dropped it off earlier. Records from Robert's past that social services had dug up. 20 years of grief documented in clinical notes and prescription records. They're using my depression against me, Robert said softly to Faith. Because I couldn't handle losing your big sister. The baby stirred, making tiny noises in her sleep. Down the hall, Hope started to fuss. Then Grace. Within seconds, all 3 were awake and crying. I'll get them, Maria said, heading for the nursery. No. Robert stood carefully, still holding Faith. They need to be together. He walked to the nursery, Sarah's old room, now transformed with 3 cribs and soft yellow walls. Hope and Grace reached toward him as he entered, their cries quieting at the sight of their sister. See, he said to Maria. They know. A sharp knock at the front door made them all jump. Faith's oxygen monitor beeped in warning. Who? Maria started. Social services, Robert growled. Their surprise inspections. He was right. Linda stood at the door in a crisp suit, 2 colleagues beside her. Mr. Hayes, she said, we need to conduct an evaluation. At 3 in the morning. We need to assess your ability to handle night care. Robert's arms tightened around Faith. Come in. They swept through the house like auditors, making notes on clipboards. Every bottle was inspected. Every diaper counted. Every medication logged. Mr. Hayes, one of Linda's colleagues called from Sarah's old room, now the nursery. Why are there photographs of another child in here? Robert's chest tightened. He'd left Sarah's pictures up. Couldn't bear to take them down. My daughter, he said. Sarah, the one who died. Linda's voice was sharp. You're keeping pictures of your dead daughter in the nursery. She's their sister, Robert snapped. They should know about her. This isn't healthy, Mr. Hayes. Linda made a note on her clipboard. Signs of unresolved grief affecting current attachment. Face monitor beeped. Her oxygen was dropping. Out, Robert ordered. All of you, out of that room now. Mr. Hayes, you're upsetting them. Out. The babies were crying again, a unified protest that filled the house. Maria helped Robert settle them together in the living room, 3 tiny bodies curled toward each other like puzzle pieces. Mr. Hayes, Linda said once the crying subsided. We've reviewed your medical history. Robert looked at the manila envelope. 20 years of grief reduced to paper. 2 years of severe clinical depression. Suicide watch. Multiple medication adjustments. After I lost everything, Robert's voice cracked. Wouldn't you break too? The concern, Linda pressed, is that you're using these children to replace. How dare you? The words came out as a growl. They're not replacements. They're not therapy. They're 3 little girls who need someone to fight for them. Your emotional instability. My emotional instability. Robert stood carefully, faith still in his arms. I lost my wife and daughter within a year. I broke. I admitted I needed help. I got better. How is that instability? The court needs to consider. The court needs to consider that I'm still here. Robert's voice rose. 20 years of helping other people's children. 20 years of volunteering. 20 years of putting myself back together. Hope started crying. Then Grace. Face monitor beeped. Look what you're doing to them, Maria snapped. Their stress levels rise every time you people show up. Linda made another note. Dependent on caregiver for emotional regulation. Get out. Robert's voice was ice. Get out of my house. Mr. Hayes, I have your court order right there. He pointed to the papers on his desk. You've done your inspection. Now get out before you make face oxygen drop more. They left, the door closing with a final click. Robert sank onto the couch, all 3 girls now gathered in his arms and Maria's. They're going to use this, he whispered. Use Sarah against me. No, Maria said firmly. They're going to try. But look, she pointed to the babies. Already their crying had stopped. Face oxygen levels were climbing. Hope and Grace had their tiny hands linked. This is what matters, Maria said. This is what the judge needs to see. Robert looked at Sarah's picture on the wall. His beautiful girl, forever 12 years old, smiling from a summer long ago. I couldn't save you, he whispered. But I'm not failing them. The rest of the night passed in quiet moments. Robert and Maria took turns holding the girls, feeding them, changing them. By dawn, all 3 slept peacefully in their cribs. Robert stood in the nursery doorway, watching them breathe. Sarah's picture smiled down at her little sisters. His phone buzzed. A text from James. Court tomorrow. They are bringing in psychological experts. Robert typed back one-handed, faith still curled against his chest. Let them come. Another buzz. They'll ask about Sarah. Robert looked at his daughter's picture. At the 3 tiny lives sleeping below it. At 20 years of grief and healing captured in one room. Good, he wrote back. Let them ask. I'm ready. The sun rose over his changed house. In a few hours, he'd have to fight again. Defend his past. Justify his present. Prove his future. But right now, in this moment, he had everything that mattered. 3 little heartbeats. 3 sets of tiny fingers. 3 reasons to keep fighting. Your big sister's watching over you, he whispered to the sleeping triplets. And so am I. Always. Face monitor beeped once. Strong, steady numbers. Like a sign. Like a promise. Robert Hayes settled into the rocking chair, ready for whatever morning would bring. The shadows of his past couldn't hurt him anymore. Not when his future slept so peacefully in front of him. The psychological evaluation room felt like an interrogation chamber. Dr. Patricia Weber sat across from Robert, her glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed his file. Outside, Maria watched the triplets in the hospital daycare. Mr. Hayes, Dr. Weber began. Let's talk about Sarah. Robert's hands tightened on his chair arms. What about her? You kept her room exactly as it was for 20 years. Yes, until 3 weeks ago, when you turned it into a nursery for the triplets. Robert met her eyes. Yes. Dr. Weber made a note. How did that feel? Like letting her help her sisters. Mr. Hayes. Dr. Weber set down her pen. Sarah is gone. These babies aren't her sisters. They are family. Robert's voice hardened. That's all that matters. Is it? She opened another file. Your hospital records show severe depression after Sarah's death. Suicidal ideation. Multiple interventions. 20 years ago. Grief doesn't have an expiration date, Mr. Hayes. A cry from outside interrupted them. Robert recognized it immediately. Faced distress cry. His body tensed, ready to move. Stay seated, Dr. Weber ordered. Maria can handle it. The crying grew louder. Then Hope and Grace joined in. They need to be together, Robert said, half rising. Mr. Hayes, this compulsive need to face monitor alarm cut through the air. Robert was moving before Dr. Weber could stop him. He burst into the daycare area where Maria struggled to comfort all three babies at once. Her oxygen's dropping, Maria said quickly. They got separated during diaper changes and Robert gathered all three girls into his arms, settling into a large chair. Almost immediately, Faith's breathing steadied. Hope and Grace curled into their sister. See? Robert looked up at Dr. Weber, who had followed him. They need this. Need each other. They need stability, Dr. Weber countered. A younger family. 2 parents. Not a grieving man trying to. I'm not trying to replace anyone. Robert's voice cracked. I'm trying to keep them together. Give them what Sarah didn't have, a chance. Your emotional attachment is exactly what they need. Maria stepped forward. I've been with them for weeks. These girls thrive with him. Faith's health improves daily. They're gaining weight, meeting milestones. Dr. Weber made another note. The court needs to consider long-term stability. Mr. Hayes, at your age, at my age, I have love to give. Robert adjusted Faith's oxygen tube. Experience. Patience. A home. What else matters? Reality matters. Dr. Weber's voice softened. You're 68. These girls will be teenagers when you're in your 80s. What then? Then they'll have each other. Robert looked down at the triplets. Sisters. Family. Something no foster home could give them. A knock at the door made them all turn. James stood there, his face grim. Robert, he said. The board called an emergency hearing. Now. What? Why? Linda's report from last night. The photos in the nursery. The depression history. They are pushing for immediate removal. Robert's arms tightened around the girls. No. Robert, no. His shout startled the babies. Faith's monitor beeped in warning. Look at them. Look. He stood carefully, the 3 girls cradled against him. Faith's oxygen drops when we're apart. Hope won't eat without her sisters. Grace cries until they are together. You want to tear that apart? Based on what? Fear. Protocol. Based on concern, Dr. Weber said. For all of you, the only thing they need to be concerned about is keeping these girls together. Robert's voice broke. I lost my daughter, my wife, everything. But I survived. I helped others. I rebuilt. That's exactly the concern, Dr. Weber pressed. You're using these babies to heal old wounds. No. Robert walked to the window, showing the girls the morning sun. They're not healing old wounds. They're making new joy. There's a difference. Faith grabbed his finger, her tiny grip strong. Hope and Grace snuggled closer. The hearing starts in an hour, James said quietly. Then they'd better be ready for a fight. Robert turned to Dr. Weber. Put whatever you want in your report. But remember this moment. Remember how they are together. Remember what you're trying to destroy. Dr. Weber studied them for a long moment. The 3 babies, perfectly content in Robert's arms, the steady beep of Faith's monitor. The quiet coos they made to each other. The court will want my professional opinion, she said finally. Give them one. Robert met her gaze. But make it the truth. Not what the system wants to hear. He walked past her, the girl secure in his arms at the door. He paused. Sarah died in this hospital, he said softly. Down that hall. I couldn't save her. Couldn't give her more time, more life, more anything. But these girls? I can give them everything. A home. Each other. Love. Love isn't always enough, Dr. Weber said. No. Robert looked down at the triplets. But it's a start. Everything else, the late nights, the doctor's appointments, the years ahead, that's just details. The love? That's the foundation. Face monitor beeped. Strong, steady numbers. 1 hour, James reminded him. 1 hour. Robert straightened his shoulders. Then we show them what family really means. He walked out, carrying his daughters toward another battle. Behind him, Dr. Weber opened her notebook and began to write the truth she'd seen. 3 babies who needed each other, and 1 man who needed them just as much. Sometimes, she wrote, the broken places in our hearts are where the light gets in. And sometimes, the most unconventional families are the ones that heal us all. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Weber took the stand. Robert sat at the defense table, the girls at home with Maria. Face oxygen monitor readings from the morning were displayed on a screen, clear evidence of her connection to her sisters and to him. Dr. Weber, the prosecutor began. In your professional opinion, is Mr. Hayes emotionally fit to care for these children? Robert held his breath. This was it, the moment that could destroy everything. Dr. Weber adjusted her glasses. When I began my evaluation, I had serious concerns. The prosecutor smiled. About his age? His history of depression? No. Dr. Weber's voice strengthened. About my own biases. About a system that would rather separate siblings than consider unconventional solutions. The prosecutor's smile vanished. Doctor, I watched those girls today, Dr. Weber continued. Watch their vital signs stabilize when they're together. Watch their absolute trust in Mr. Hayes. That's not coincidence. That's not desperation. That's family. Robert's hands shook under the table. James squeezed his shoulder. The depression in his file, the prosecutor tried again, shows a man who faced devastating loss, got help, and rebuilt his life. Dr. Weber leaned forward. 20 years of volunteer work. Countless families helped. That's not instability. That's resilience. Judge Martinez studied her notes. Dr. Weber, in your report, you mentioned the photographs in the nursery. Yes, Your Honor. Photos of Sarah, Mr. Hayes' late daughter. And you don't find this concerning? I find it honest. Dr. Weber looked at Robert. These girls aren't replacements for Sarah. They are additions to her legacy. The photos tell them about their family, their history. That's healthy. The prosecutor shuffled papers. Mr. Hayes' age is balanced by his experience, patience, and resources. Dr. Weber's tone sharpened. I've evaluated dozens of potential adoptive families. Few showed his level of commitment, understanding, or emotional intelligence. A commotion at the back of the courtroom drew their attention. Maria rushed in, pushing a stroller with all 3 girls. I'm sorry, she called out. Faith's oxygen dropped. She needs Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez said immediately. Go. Robert was already moving. The moment he reached the stroller, Faith's monitor steadied. Hope and Grace reached for him. The court can see, Dr. Weber said quietly, what I saw this morning. These aren't just case numbers. This is a family. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, while this is touching, we have protocols. Look at the monitor. Dr. Weber pointed to Faith's readings. Look at the science. These girls need each other. Need him. Everything else is just paperwork. Robert lifted Faith carefully, checking her oxygen tube. Hope grabbed his pants leg. Grace reached up from the stroller. Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez called. Please approach with the children. Robert walked forward slowly. 3 babies somehow balanced in his arms. The courtroom watched in silence. Dr. Weber, the judge said, your final recommendation. These children belong together. Dr. Weber's voice filled the room. And they belong with him. Any other decision would cause demonstrable harm. The prosecutor tried one last time. The financial burden is handled, James interrupted, standing. Mr. Hayes has liquidated his investments. Set up a trust fund. Arrange for long-term care if needed. The papers are all here. Robert looked down at his girls. Everything he owned, everything he'd saved, all of it now dedicated to their future. Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez said softly, you understand what you're taking on? The years ahead won't be easy. Nothing worth doing is easy, Your Honor. Robert adjusted Faith's oxygen tube. But they are worth everything. The system has concerns. The system, Robert cut in, would have separated them. Sent them to different counties. Made sure they never knew each other existed. How is that better than one home? One family? Hope started fussing. Then Grace. Faith's monitor beeped once. Without thinking, Robert began to sway gently, a motion he'd learned in countless late-night sessions. The girls quieted immediately. "Well," Dr. Weber said into the silence, "I think they've made their opinion clear." Judge Martinez studied the scene before her. 3 babies, perfectly content in the arms of a man who'd moved heaven and earth to keep them together. "The financial reports," she asked James. "Hey, Your Honor." He handed over a thick folder. "Everything liquidated. House paid off. Trust fund established. Even a college savings plan started. Medical arrangements." Part-time nurse continued. "Pediatric team assembled. Monitoring systems installed at home." "And?" The judge hesitated. "If something happens to Mr. Hayes." "Maria has agreed to be their guardian," James said, "along with a trust fund and detailed care instructions. Everything's arranged." Robert held his breath. Faith grabbed his finger. Hope kicked her tiny feet. Grace yawned. "Dr. Weber," the judge said finally, "you stake your professional reputation on this recommendation?" "Absolutely. No hesitation. These girls belong together. They belong with him." The judge looked at her papers. At the monitor showing Faith's steady vitals. At 3 babies who somehow fit perfectly in one man's arms. "The court will recess for 1 hour," she announced. "Mr. Hayes, stay with the children. Their health clearly depends on it." As people filed out, Robert sank onto a nearby bench. James sat beside him. "You sold everything?" Robert asked quietly. "You told me to." James smiled. "Every investment, every asset, all converted to their future. Sarah's college fund too. Now it's their college fund." James touched Hope's tiny hand. "She'd want that." Robert looked at his daughters. His everything. Whatever the judge decided, he'd given them all he had. Every penny, every breath, every piece of his heart. Faith's monitor beeped steadily. Hope grabbed her sister's hand. Grace watched them all with curious eyes. 1 hour, James said. 1 hour. Robert held them closer. Then we find out if love really is enough. The empty courtroom echoed with baby sounds, tiny coos, gentle breaths, the steady beep of Faith's monitor. Robert Hayes, who had lost everything once, now held everything that mattered, and waited for the world to decide if he could keep it. The hour passed like molasses. Robert paced the courthouse hallway, Faith in his arms while Hope and Grace dozed in their stroller. James watched the clock, adjusting his tie every few minutes. "Mr. Hayes." Robert turned. Linda from Social Services stood there, her usual clipboard missing. "What do you want?" His voice came out harder than intended. "To help." She stepped closer, watching Faith's monitor. "Those numbers, they are better than the hospital's. Because she's with her sisters." "With me?" Linda nodded slowly. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. Following protocols. Checking boxes." She touched Faith's tiny hand. "Maybe it's time to make new boxes." Before Robert could respond, Dr. Matthews burst through the courthouse doors, still in his scrubs. "Sorry I'm late," he called. "Emergency surgery." "Did I miss?" "Recess for another 20 minutes, James said. Dr. Matthews approached Robert, checking Faith's oxygen levels. "Better than ever. All 3 of them are thriving." "The judge needs to see that," Linda said suddenly. Everyone stared at her. "What?" "I can change my mind." Hope started fussing in the stroller. Without a word, Linda lifted her carefully, professionally. "You've done this before," Robert said. "Foster care supervisor for 10 years before Social Services." She settled Hope against her shoulder. "Sometimes the system works. Sometimes." She looked at the triplets. "Sometimes we need to work around it." The courthouse doors opened again. Chairman Wilson from the hospital board walked in, followed by several staff members. "Robert." Wilson approached slowly. "The board. We've been talking about support." Wilson handed James a paper. "We'd like to establish a permanent medical fund for the girls. Staff have been donating sick days, vacation time." Robert's vision blurred. "Why?" "Because you showed us something." Wilson looked at the babies. "Something bigger than protocols and procedures. Something real." More people filtered in. Nurses, doctors, volunteers. Each one touched the girls gently, offering quiet support. "The court will reconvene in 5 minutes, a clerk announced. Robert looked around the crowded hallway. So many faces. So much support. "I don't understand," he whispered to James. "You built this," James said simply. 20 years of helping others. Now they are helping back. They filed into the courtroom. Robert settled in his chair, Faith still in his arms, her sisters nearby in the stroller. The crowd filled every seat. Judge Martinez entered, pausing at the sight of the packed room. "Well," she said, "it seems we have some additional input." One by one, they spoke. Dr. Matthews about the girls' health improvements. Linda about changing outdated protocols. Wilson about community support. Each voice added another brick to the foundation Robert had built. "Your Honor," Linda said finally, "Social Services would like to revise our recommendation." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, protocols clearly state, protocols," Linda cut in, "are guidelines, not chains. Look at those girls. Look at their vital signs. Look at the community that's formed around them. That's what we're supposed to fight for." Faith grabbed Robert's finger, her grip strong. Hope and Grace watched from their stroller, unusually quiet. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Martinez said, "you've liquidated everything for them." "Yes." "Left yourself nothing?" "No." Robert looked at his daughters. "Left myself everything that matters." The judge studied her papers. "Dr. Matthews, their health improving daily. Faith's oxygen needs are decreasing. All three gaining weight, meeting milestones. Linda, the system needs to adapt, Your Honor. These girls have shown us that. The community support." Wilson stood. "Complete, Your Honor. Medical care, financial assistance, practical help, all arranged." Judge Martinez looked at Robert. Really looked at him, beyond the gray hair and tired eyes. 20 years ago," she said, "you lost everything." "Yes, and now you're risking everything again." "No risk." Robert's voice strengthened. "Just love." Faith's monitor beeped. Strong, steady numbers. Hope kicked her feet. Grace watched the room with curious eyes. "The court notes," Judge Martinez began, "that protocols exist for a reason." Robert's heart sank. "However," she continued, "the court also notes that protocols must serve people, not the other way around." The room held its breath. Dr. Weber's report is compelling. The medical evidence, undeniable. The community support, overwhelming. The judge set down her papers. "But what convinces this court is something simpler." She pointed to Faith's monitor, to Hope's hand reaching for her sister, to Grace watching it all. "Love," the judge said simply. "Real, sacrificial, unconditional love." Robert held Faith closer. "The court hereby grants temporary custody of Faith, Hope, and Grace Hayes to Robert Hayes, pending final adoption proceedings in 6 months." The room erupted. Robert barely heard it. His world had narrowed to 3 tiny faces, 3 beating hearts, 3 futures now securely linked to his. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Martinez called over the noise. He looked up. "Don't make me regret this." "Never," he whispered. Faith's monitor beeped in agreement. Hope and Grace babbled happily. Outside the courtroom, the crowd celebrated. Linda hugged him carefully. Mindful of Faith in his arms, Dr. Matthews checked vital signs one more time. Wilson discussed medical arrangements with James. But Robert stood quiet, holding his daughters. Through the courthouse windows, he could see the hospital where it all began. Where he'd lost Sarah. Where he'd found new purpose. "Ready to go home?" Maria asked softly. "Home. Not just a house anymore. Not just memories of what was lost. Home. Where 3 little girls would grow together. Where love had built something new from the ashes of grief." "Yes," Robert said. "Let's go home." Faith's monitor beeped steadily as they walked out into the sunshine. Hope and Grace reached for each other in their stroller. And Robert Hayes, who had once lost everything, carried his whole world in his arms. 6 months passed in a blur of diapers, bottles, and midnight feedings. Robert stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the final adoption hearing. Down the hall, he heard Maria getting the girls ready. "Faith, stop squirming," she called. "Hope, leave your sister's hair alone." Robert smiled. At 9 months old, the triplets had distinct personalities. Faith, the fighter, now rarely needed oxygen support. Hope, the mischief maker, constantly reached for her sisters. Grace, the peacekeeper, watched everything with quiet eyes. "Daddy," Hope's voice carried down the hall. She'd said it first, 3 weeks ago. The others followed within days. Robert walked to the nursery, Sarah's old room, now fully transformed. 3 cribs, though the girls usually ended up sleeping together. Photos on the walls, Sarah smiling down at her sisters. New pictures of the triplets growing stronger each day. Look who's all dressed up, Maria said, wrangling Grace into a tiny dress. All three girls wore matching outfits, white with purple ribbons. Da. Faith reached for him. Robert lifted her carefully, checking her breathing out of habit. Perfect numbers. Ready for our big day? He asked, helping Maria with the other girls. A knock at the door interrupted them. Linda stood there, no clipboard in sight. Just wanted to check in before court, she said, smiling at the girls. Though I can see everything's perfect. Not perfect. Robert adjusted Hope's ribbon. Real. The drive to the courthouse felt different this time. No anxiety, no fear. Just three baby voices babbling in their car seats and the certainty of coming home together. The courtroom was packed again. Dr. Matthews, Chairman Wilson, hospital staff, volunteers, the family they'd built over 6 months of love and care. Judge Martinez entered, smiling at the sight of the girls playing on a blanket near Robert's chair. Well, she said, this looks familiar. Though much happier. The proceedings began. James presented final paperwork. Dr. Matthews reported on the girls' health progress. Linda confirmed all requirements met and exceeded. Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez said finally. Any last words before I make this permanent? Robert looked at his daughters. At Sarah's picture in his wallet. At the community that had become family. 6 months ago, he said, I stood here with nothing but hope and love. Today, he picked up Faith as she crawled toward him. Hope and Grace followed, grabbing his legs. Today I stand here with everything. The judge nodded. The court has reviewed all documentation. Observed the family bonds. Considered expert testimony. She smiled and watched 3 little girls bloom under love that defied every protocol. Robert held his breath. The court hereby grants permanent adoption of Faith, Hope, and Grace Hayes to Robert Hayes. She looked at the girls, though it seems they already knew they were his. The room erupted in cheers. Faith grabbed Robert's tie. Hope clapped her tiny hands. Grace smiled her quiet smile. Da. They called in unison. Robert gathered them close, tears falling freely now. Around them, their extended family celebrated. Dr. Matthews hugged Maria. Linda high-fived James. Chairman Wilson shook hands with everyone. Mr. Hayes, Judge Martinez called over the noise. He looked up. Sarah would be proud. Robert's heart swelled. She is. She sent them to me. Outside the courthouse, the summer sun shone bright. Robert settled the girls in their stroller. Faith holding Hope's hand, Grace watching butterflies. Home? Maria asked. Almost. Robert checked his watch. One stop first. They drove to DVAL Hospital, to the entrance where it all began. Storm clouds gathered, just like that first night. Look, girls, Robert said softly. This is where we found each other. Thunder rumbled. Faith looked up at the sky, unafraid. Hope reached for her sisters. Grace watched it all with knowing eyes. Mr. Hayes. He turned. A young mother stood there, fear in her eyes, a baby in her arms. I need help, she whispered. Robert looked at his daughters. At the hospital where he'd lost everything and found everything. At the storms that brought both endings and beginnings. Come on, he said gently. Let's get you inside. The automatic doors opened. Faith babbled happily, recognizing the place. Hope waved at passing nurses. Grace watched the scared mother with compassionate eyes. Nancy, Robert called to the familiar nurse at the desk. We need help here. And so it began again. Not with loss this time, but with love. Not with endings, but with new beginnings. Later that night, Robert sat in the nursery rocking chair. All 3 girls piled in his lap despite their separate cribs. Sarah's picture watched over them, her smile eternal. Thank you, he whispered to her, for showing me the way. Faith snuggled closer. Hope grabbed her sister's hand. Grace sighed contentedly. Outside, the storm passed. Inside, in a room that had known both grief and joy, a family slept peacefully. Robert Hayes held his daughters close, knowing that sometimes the greatest love stories don't end with happily ever after. Sometimes they begin there. Faith's breathing came steady and strong. No monitors needed now. Hope's fingers stayed linked with her sister's, even in sleep. Grace's peaceful face showed complete trust. And Robert, who had once walked empty halls trying to fill an endless void, now had arms full of love and a heart overflowing with purpose. The adoption certificate would hang on the wall tomorrow. But the real proof of family lay sleeping in his arms, 3 little lives that had changed everything. 3 hearts beating in sync with his. 3 reasons to believe that love, in the end, is all that matters. "Daddy's here," he whispered, just as he had that first night. Always. And in their sleep, 3 baby girls smiled, knowing they were home.